Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the virtual platform of the Mariana Kistler Beach Museum of Art. Tonight's program is a conversation between me, Aileen June Wang, co-curator of the exhibition Gordon Parks, Homeward to the Prairie I, and Ms. Theresa Ruth Howard, international diversity strategist for the arts and founder and curator of Memoirs of Blacks in Ballet, also known as mobballet.org. Before we get into the heart of the program, a few reminders. Closed captioning is available. Click on the CC icon at the bottom of the screen or on the top right-hand corner. Many thanks to our closed captioner for the evening, Sharon Lang. Many thanks also to our webinar host, Jennifer Harlan, who will be making sure that the webinar is running smoothly behind the scenes. This program is being recorded and will be made available later in the museum's YouTube channel. At that time, there will be a transcript that will accompany the recording. For the benefit of audience members who are primarily listening, I will offer brief descriptions of what we are discussing when possible. So I'll start with a brief description of myself. I am a woman of Chinese descent with short, straight, dark brown hair, and I am wearing a brown tweed jacket. With me is distinguished guest speaker, Ms. Theresa Ruth Howard. Theresa, would you give a brief description of yourself for our audience?
Absolutely. I am an African-American woman. I am chestnut hue. I have a burgundy and sort of cream stripe pattern shirt on. My hair is in a turban of the same color, different pattern. I'm against a white wall with a window over my right shoulder and my Ma Ballet logo over my left shoulder.
And I'll just add that Ms. Howard looks beautiful and fashionable. And let me introduce all of you to her. The New York Times said that Theresa Ruth Howard was, quote, a force for change in ballet, and the world is catching up, end quote. She established Memoirs of Blacks in Ballet, mobballet.org, a digital platform that presents and promotes the contributions of Blacks in ballet. She has been a contributing writer for Dance Magazine and has also published in The Source and Point, Expressions in Italy, and Tanz in Germany. As a dancer, Ms. Howard was a member of the Dance Theater of Harlem and Armitage Gone Dance. She has worked extensively with choreographer Donald Byrd and has been a guest artist with Complexions Contemporary Ballet. She was a member of the ballet faculty at the Ailey School for over 18 years and has taught and choreographed internationally in conservatories, universities, festivals, and intensives. Currently, she works as a diversity strategist for the arts internationally. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that K-State, as the first land-grant institution established under the 1862 Morrill Act, is historically home to many Native nations, including the Kaw, Osage, and Pawnee. Furthermore, Kansas is the current home to 4 federally recognized Native nations: the Prairie Band Potawatomi, the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska. Many Native nations utilize the Western Plains of Kansas as their hunting grounds, and others, such as the Delaware, were moved through this region during Indian removal efforts to make way for white settlers. K-State and every university in the US are on indigenous land. The recognition that America's history begins and continues through indigenous contexts is essential to this museum, which seeks to create decolonized spaces at the university and increase the presence, promotion, and support of indigenous and other traditionally marginalized faculty, staff, and students at K-State. The topic of tonight's program is Martin, a ballet film by Gordon Parks, based on the life of Martin Luther King Jr., which aired on PBS stations in January of 1990. The ballet was always intended as a film. My research so far indicates that it was never a live performance. Parks composed the music and wrote the story for the ballet, and he recorded the music with the Munich Symphony. He was the executive producer as well. Parks hired Rael Lamb as choreographer, and Lamb in turn cast the dancers. Lamb was a dancer with the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater. A news article in the Orlando Sentinel in 1990 about the airing of the film quoted Parks as saying, quote, "There's some things you have to do without regard for money. You say, let's do it right. This ballet was one of them. This is for me, from my heart. And usually it works out that if you like it, other people will like it too," end quote. Just to give you guys some context, Parks completed the film Moments Without Proper Names in 1986, so just a few years before. And this was a film where he mixed his photographs from different series and different periods in his career, set to his own music, and including poetry and text that he wrote. PBS broadcasted this film in 1987, so just 3 years before. To establish a basic point of reference, I will show you now brief excerpts from Parks's film, Martin. So first will be 2 one-minute excerpts from Prelude. This is the first part of the film, and Parks introduces the film, and he also shows his photographs set to his music, and using different photographs from different series and different time periods, mixing them together in a loop to tell a new story. So I will share screen and show you 2 excerpts from that. So hold on a sec. So this is the first excerpt. So before I go on to the next, I just want to double check, can everyone see that and hear? Yes? Okay.
Yes.
Great. Thanks, Theresa. So this is the second excerpt I want to show you.
Hello, I'm Gordon Parks. Those are the human beings and conditions Martin is concerned about. He wanted to brighten lives and free us of hunger and depression. So he spent his final days preaching love to people of all colors, only to have a racist blast a bullet through his neck. Before night fell, the skies were darkening to arson and smoke. The black ghetto's answer to the racist deed. Now that he lay dead, we began to wonder if love was enough. Racism still engulfed us. Blacks and whites were buying guns. Army troops stood ready. And our president was warned against going to Atlanta for the funeral. It was an hour of prayer and violence, when like a river of blackness, we flowed behind the old wagon that bore him to his grave.
Okay, so those are two excerpts from the prelude. And now I'm going to show an excerpt from the last act. So there are 5 acts in total. This is the last one, and it's the funeral scene of Reverend King's. Okay, so I'll stop here. So in this scene, you see a scene of Reverend King's funeral, and his spirit rises from his body. So this is a characteristic of it being a film where he overlays 2 scenes. And Reverend King is dancing with different children of different ethnic backgrounds, followed by a corps of Black and white dancers. I'm going to stop sharing screen now and come back to our guest speaker. So Theresa, from the standpoint of a dancer, choreographer, and someone who knows a lot about the history of African Americans in dance, what do you see as significant in this ballet film that Gordon Parks created?
That it exists at all, right? I mean, when you think about it, we have a number of ballet companies in the country. We have ballet like Atlanta Ballet, the Memphis Ballet Memphis. They don't have Martin Luther King ballets in the repertoire, right? You could say that a lack of diversity might make that difficult, because in order to have a Martin Luther King ballet, you have to have a dancer who can play Martin Luther King, a dancer who could probably play, you know, Coretta. Like there's a lack there, right? But what amazes me about this is that you see Gordon Parks as a Black creative creating regardless of medium, right? So we know him as a photographer, certainly, and a filmmaker, but you see him using the medium of dance to tell this story. And he's saying that, like, this needs to happen. I'm creating this. Maybe I'm not the perfect person even to create it, but it should exist. It should be in the world. And so probably, no doubt, you know, using his own resources and his own network to make this this possible, because he was acknowledging a lack of the documentation, right, of African American history in a way through the arts.
Yeah, and what I note here is that most of the principal dancers are Black, and I'll bet that's very different from most ballets you'll see. And you had noted in our conversation before about the significance of dance theater of Harlem. Can you comment on that? And also, you know, in relation to when this ballet film came out in 1990?
Sure. So like, as I mentioned, in order to tell a Black man's story, right, a story about civil rights, right, then you need to have those brown and Black bodies present in the creative space to do that. So again, this is probably one of the reasons why many of the what we now call historically white ballet companies did not approach it. They could not, right? That it was not possible. We just had Tulsa Ballet do a project about the Tulsa race massacre, and they had to bring in guests, Black
Mm.
ballet artists, because they didn't have the bodies of color to tell that story. So what's interesting about Dance Theater of Harlem is where Arthur Mitchell and Carl Shook are creating a space where Black ballet dancers have access and opportunity to be on the stage. We were right around, but not necessarily being able to enter into those ballet companies with regularity. It was not normative. Creating this sort of oasis, if you will, of Black ballet artists did not necessarily create diversity in the field at large, right? It just
Mhm.
created this repository for companies to go, oh, that's your space over there,
Mm. Mhm.
right?
Mm.
So the other thing that I found interesting in our conversation was looking at, why would parks decide to make a ballet film? Because this definitely is a ballet film. You can almost see the libretto written in almost storyboard, right? And also some of the special effects that he's using. I mean, now we look at it and we go, okay, because it was 1990, but you see that he's not creating it for the proscenium stage. And what I remember is that in the late 80s, the 80s and into the 90s, there was a Danish company called Art House, and they created these ballet films. Almost, they did like Giselle, they did Troy Game, like the Dance Theater did a number of them, and they would be over in Denmark for like a month or 2 months creating these films, but they were basically the proscenium version of Giselle, but shot with a cinematic sort of in a cinematic sort of way with a little bit of special effects. So when I saw this and I looked at the data, I bet that Gordon Parks said, you know what, he saw one of those films and says, you know what, that's what we should do. Like, I can't maybe create a ballet and put it up in a theater, but there's another way of telling the story. And clearly, since PBS was buying these films, then there was a chance of selling it, of it being shown somewhere. So that's my speculation on how maybe in Gordon Parks' mind, this project came to be.
Yeah, and in our previous conversation too, you had pointed out that Dance Theater of Harlem staged Creole Giselle in 1984, and then it was filmed for television in 1987, and NBC aired it. So
Right.
and so you were saying at that time, like, you bet Gordon Parks saw that, and then I mean, even thinking about the topic, right? So this is significant. Creole Giselle was significant as this, ballet aired on mainstream, channel, featuring all Black cast. But the topic is still, I mean, the story is not an African American story. And so, Martin as a ballet is significant in, having a story that is from African American history.
Absolutely. And it's like, if we look at this in terms of, YouTube or TikTok, right? So we see Creole Giselle filmed and aired at PBS, and that is like almost like an influencer, right? So you go like, oh, other people want to do that. That's another way of creating content, if you will. This is content that somebody, if we create it independently, then it can be purchased by an outlet, and then people get to see it at large.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's really interesting to look at this in this historical sort of context to see, like, how did a project like this come about? I just learned before we started that Because one of the questions we were discussing was, how did he come to hire a modern choreographer? And why wasn't this a natural project for Dance Theater of Harlem? Well, I just found out that Arthur Mitchell and Gordon Parks, at least Arthur Mitchell had issue with Gordon Parks.
Oh.
Because I only have one side of the story, right? So I don't know how Gordon Parks felt about Arthur Mitchell, but so they at least at periods and points in time, and I was trying to get her to remember when this was, because this dancer was introduced to Gordon Parks by Arthur Mitchell, and he said, "I'm only doing this because you really want to meet him, because he, like we don't get along." And so, right. So if we look at it that way, it would be a thing that where Gordon Parks would go like, I'm just going to figure out how to make this on my own. And since, maybe Dance Theater of Harlem is not an option, then I'm going to create sort of a project, a pickup company, if you will, right? And get this done, because as he said in the prologue, like it was something that needed to be done.
Yeah. Yeah. And just a note for our audience, Arthur Mitchell was the founder and first director of Studio Theater of Harlem.
Dance Theater of Harlem. Yes.
I mean, Dance Theater of Harlem, sorry. And actually, Theresa, you had also pointed out to me the significance of Martin as a project that's outside of Dance Theater of Harlem, being another opportunity so that, Gordon Parks in a way did his part to expand the opportunities for African-American ballet dancers, with this project.
Absolutely. And so this is indicative, I think, of just creators in general, but definitely Black creators, right? Like all of the companies that we see, whether that be Dance Theater of Harlem or Alvin Ailey, kind of started in this sort of pickup sort of way. And they were community based, that the community comes together, right, to make this project possible. Like if you look at some of the old programs for some of these projects, like maybe they're at the 92nd Street Y, it's amazing to see how collaborative the community was. You'll see Joffrey Holder did the costumes, and this person did the lighting, and Alvin Ailey was dancing for Arthur Mitchell. Everybody was, because the opportunities were so scarce, right? And the community is so small that everybody was supporting everybody else. And sometimes they got paid in meals, right? They would like, I can't pay you, but I'll cook dinner at my apartment. So it is that community collaborative, the pulling together of resources, the using your network, that it seems that Parks relied on here.
And speaking of the Alvin Ailey Dance Company, Catherine Schlajek, our Associate Curator of Education, is asking, when was that company formed, and was it an option for Gordon Parks when he did this film?
I think that Alvin Ailey is like 60 years old now, the company. And here's the thing, it seems to me that he wanted to do a ballet, right? That's, Alvin Ailey is a modern dance company, right? So I think he aesthetically, I feel like it was important to him that these dancers the women are on point, right? That's very clear, because that's a choice, because he could have absolutely gone to either the Ailey Company or the myriad of different modern dance talents that were in the city of New York. But it's a very specific aesthetic that it seems like he's after, because he's hiring at least the ballet females to be on point. And I think that is, honoring that hierarchy of art, right? So it's like in my mind, I say, okay, this is a black man's story, but we're going to put it in a balletic context, which gives it more value on that hierarchical scale, right? It's a level of refinement, respectability politics, right? That possibly at play. It could have just been that is what his vision is. I may be reading into it.
No, I agree with you there, because I see that as an art historian studying his photographs, I see that too, where he's using his photographs to engage with, iconic artworks in Western art history, which are all, created by white male artists. And he's intentionally engaging those works, placing himself in that context. And I think he's doing the same thing here with the ballet or the ballet film.
Yes.
I have another burning question for you, and it's that there were very few commentaries about this film. There were two that were contemporary reviews of the film, and they only assessed it briefly, but both said that the story and the dancing are formulaic. But then they would say that, and then they went on to praise like Gordon Parks for doing this and all that. So I'm curious, what do you think of the film as a dance film? And what do you think of the staging and the choreography?
Okay, this is a trick question, because it's very, very layered, right? So like as a writer, I've written about implicit bias in dance criticism and the inability for specifically white dance critics or art critics to enter, right, the art of people of color, and the minimizing and the reduction. Sorry, that's my dog on my couch scratching. Apologies.
Oh, we all have that.
But like how it can be reductive when they don't understand it, or they can't enter the culture or the story, or even the aesthetic, right? So that's one trick of the trade, is to not talk about the stuff that you don't understand and refocus, instead of just being honest and going like, well, I don't understand this part of it, but this is what I know, right? This is what, from my perspective, from my lens, this is how I see it. So I think it's sort of tricky in that context. I think that when you look at it in 2022, it does feel dated. Like you see the quality of the film, and our eyes, our lens, and of expectation, right? Even the level of dancing has shifted. I mean, I have fellow dance teachers who teach dance history that goes like, I don't even show old film anymore, because the dancing, the level of the dancing is not what is of today. So when you look at old footage, of Margot Fontaine, and she looks like, if that was on stage today, we'd be like, ooh, she's not a prima ballerina, right? So the expectation, right? The aesthetics have changed. The art form has evolved. So whenever we're looking back on things, we have to, kind of put that into context to say, well, what was the standard of the day, right? And so the other layer of that would also be the concept of, we have no idea what it took to get this together. We have no idea the timeline, the budget, the timeline, who was available to rehearse when, right? There's a big difference between what you can do in 3 weeks and what you can do in 3 months, right? So we don't know if this is really a labor of love, where people are like, I'm going to rehearse, I can be there, for 2 hours, but the rehearsal is 6. We don't know. So we're making an assumption just because he pulled it off, right? We don't have all of that backstory. And I think that it's really, we do know that this is probably self-produced, right? So we can think about, I don't want to make an assumption about Gordon Parks's, finances, but we're thinking somebody is self-producing this. And this is a big project. This is a film project with a lot of people, right? So I like to take that into consideration. And so it would be interesting to be able to find out what the rehearsal period was, like what the context was. I myself am working on a project with the Kennedy Center and trying to build a small pickup company. And what we're going through with trying to get people and lining up schedules, it's really intense. So sometimes we forget that.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
When we're watching something. Those are the things that jump out at me. Is it the most fantastic choreography? No, but there are a lot of bad ballets out there. Right? So we like, and this is also I think a byproduct of institutionalized racism and the different expectations for different people. The idea that, there are a lot of bad white ballet
Mhm.
films with bad choreography.
Mhm.
We're not looking at them through the lens. We have this one that has to
Mhm.
bear the weight
Mhm.
of everything, right?
Mhm.
So then the
Mhm.
expectation becomes greater. And so that's part of the burden of excellence, right? Like that you cannot be mediocre. You have to be twice as good. And so I would ask that anybody viewing this, take that lens off, like check themselves for that sort of socialized implicit bias when you're looking at it, and really look at it as a piece of art that was somehow made when nobody else was
Mhm.
thinking about making it.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm very humbled by what you said, because I realized too that I have that implicit bias, because when I was looking at it, I was thinking, why didn't the choreographer be more creative, in terms of the dance moves? But like you said, like, well, who knows how much time he had.
Oh, you froze for me. Are you still there?
Aileen, are you with us?
While we figure that, I noticed that Linda Duke said it seems likely that the classically trained ballet dancers were not necessarily experienced with performing for camera angles. Who was at that time? For concert dancers, again, this is the 90s. The filming of dance wasn't normalized, right? Until probably in the 90s. I mean, I had done projects where and also only big like opera houses would document, right, the performances. So for instance, New York, the Met, or back in the day, New York City Opera would be the person or be the entities that would really make a point of making a video archive of things. And so I don't think that stage dancers or concert dancers, that was not the forte, right? For it's not, and it's not their responsibility. That would be the camera person's responsibility. We lost Aileen.
Theresa, we did lose Aileen, but we do have a few questions in Q&A I'd like to share with you. Our fellow curator here at the Beach Museum, Elizabeth Seaton, has posed the following question. She said, at a few points in the ballet, I heard music evocative of the Wicked Witch of the West refrain in The Wizard of Oz, Act 1. And this came about after the protest rally in the assassin attends. And Act 5 during a part of the graveyard dance. And she was wondering if this was intentional, to your knowledge?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I'm assuming that it probably was. Because
I can't imagine him doing anything that was just off the cuff. It seems like everything would be very deliberate.
Well, he wrote the score. So we have to assume that if that is in fact what we're hearing, then that was intentional.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So that much we can put together, right? So he wrote the score. So it's not like he was choosing music that already existed. So I'm gonna say yes.
Okay. That would make sense to me.
Oh, Aileen, it might be back. I'm gonna do one more while she comes in.
Yeah, we have our curatorial assistants posing the following question. This is from Hannah Palsa. And she said, as a historian, I have to admit that historical musicals, particularly Jason Robert Brown's Parade and Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton, are some of my favorites. Do you think that more historical moments could be adopted into ballet if the correct performers could be found? And she suggests that Ida B. Wells would be wonderful.
I'm going to say yes, right? I mean, I think there are so many stories to be told that, and about, you're back, yay.
Sorry.
We held it down for you though. Technology, I know. But we're talking about the idea of, you know, the stories that could be told through ballet. I think that we're seeing part of that now. I mean, like we're getting, you know, things like Anna Karenina. There are stories being told by like that are fictional. And I think that, for instance, Tamara Rojo just did a new Ramonda that sort of echoed the story of Florence Nightingale, right? So absolutely. The question is are we going to actively work to, because if we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion through these classical art forms, then are we going to actively work to bring those stories forth, right? And so, and then be creative, if not just diversify our companies, be creative about getting them done. Because if the barrier is we don't have the cultural competence, or we don't have the actual artists to create these, then it's incumbent upon the entity to do something about that. That is something that is worthy of a process and a project.
Theresa, the curator, Elizabeth Seaton, followed up with a question about asking whether you had any thoughts about the particular score he chose for this in general.
I don't judge it that way, right? Like again, and maybe it's just because of the work that I do now. And when I am looking at the history of specifically Blacks in ballet and what they had to, the lengths that they had to go to participate on the smallest level.
That's an excellent point.
Right? Just the fact, like you might have heard that my existence is resistance, right? So the idea that you can even create art, that you can think creatively, you can have imagination inside this system that's built to break you, right? So when I look at that, I just wonder at the amazement that this man was a wealth of creativity and ingenuity. You know, a Black man of his time as an artist being revered in his own time. And then creating these other opportunities for artists. I personally, I don't, and that's also not my forte, but I just take it for what it is.
Yeah. And I remember telling you before that I was like, you know, the choreography to me seemed formulaic, and you said to me, you know, you really need to think about what they were working with or without, you know. And I mean, thinking about that, yeah, I mean, Martin, the ballet was not being staged by, you know, American Ballet Company, you know. So in terms of resources, and this is like pretty much Gordon Parks said it was self-funded, you know, he's listed as the executive producer, and he said it's for him and coming from his heart. So I think that in terms of being, you know, a critic, that's something that the contemporary critics at that time didn't take into account.
Not at all.
You know, and that was unfair. And I started thinking about it more, where both critics said, well, you know, we saw the ballet didn't really say anything about Martin Luther King Jr., the man. And I was thinking, well, maybe that's not Gordon Parks's purpose, you know what I mean? And I think that, you know, he was really elevated into this like almost angel that had come down, you know, to help African American communities. And I was thinking maybe he's projecting or reflecting how Martin Luther King Jr. was viewed by African Americans. So
and why isn't there a space
yeah,
for it not to be what you think it should be?
Yes.
White people.
Yeah.
right? Like it's not yours. Maybe it's not talking to you. Maybe that's not, this is, and this is the again, the bias in criticism. I was expecting this work to look a certain way. That happens a lot, right? We see this in music, we see this in fine art, when white people don't, when Black art does not reflect what white people think Black art should look like if it's abstract or if it's, you know, like they're befuddled and bemused by the fact that I don't get it. No, your lens is that of, there's an expectation because there's a bias about Blackness, right? So again, like it's, can we just look at it for what it is? Right? The story is what it is. You know, do we say this? You don't say this of Petipa, do you? I don't know. It could have been so many different things.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, I'm just going to say that, you know, your comment made me rethink this. And I'm really humbled, and I've learned a lot. And our museum director, Linda Duke, has a comment here. She said, your comments are making me think that there is an element of generosity in Parks's decision to use a traditional European art form to tell the story of Martin. He's inviting non-Black audiences to enter this story.
I don't know. I feel like artists create in their mediums, right? So like if we're actually thinking, yes, the origins of, okay, let me try to get this right. Yes, the origins of artistic genres or whatever, that's important. But why do we, when we see Black people or brown people, non-white people, engaging in a medium that does not align historically with their ethnicity or their race? Why is that outside of? Whereas white people get to be all over the place, up in everything, and we're never saying, well, I wonder if Michelle Dorrance is choosing tap dance as a way of inviting. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's right. So it's art. People resonate to art regardless of race, creed, economic status, right? Where you are in the world, you see something, it resonates, it's beauty. Like I'm reflecting on Andre Leon Talley now, who just passed away, who was all just about beauty and art and how it is universal. It is the way that humans, like the best of humans. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we should be able to move and flow, right? And engage. And it doesn't mean that he's trying to, like, he was an African-American man. And if we look at ballet in this country, if you look at my timeline on my ballet, there's evidence that a gentleman named George Washington Smith, who was rumored to be mulatto, was a clogger, right? And was white passing. Fanny Ellsler, the Austrian ballerina, came over, asked him to be her partner. And in 1846, he ended up premiering Giselle in Boston as Albrecht. So Black people have been in the art form of ballet since it hit the shores of America. This is not actually odd in ways. Like there's data that says that Black people in the 1800s and earlier were creating classical music. Why is it that it should not surprise us? Bridgerton is actually more real than we know, right? The idea, I just found out that there was a Black Russian woman in the Russian Imperial Ballet and premiered in Sleeping Beauty. Yeah.
I would say if Gordon Parks hears what you're saying, he will say yes, you know, and I think that he would say that he has every right to be in all these art forms and it's, you know, part of him, period.
Well, I'm just gonna go like, let's spread the wealth. If white people can do anything they want. They can enter hip hop, they can enter Bollywood, they can salsa, they can like
Sure.
nobody asked
Yes.
that question,
Mm.
right? We
Mm-hmm.
accept that,
Yeah.
right? That is what we need to start to flip because it is limiting,
Mm.
right? Why does the same spectrum of possibility not exist in non-whiteness, right? As it does in whiteness. We understand that spectrum of possibility in whiteness, right? But we need to open that up and go, oh, that same spectrum exists in everyone, including non-white people. The difference is maybe access, opportunity, right? Not the ability.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the difference. And I think that this is Gordon Parks, Alvin Ailey, Arthur Mitchell, Catherine Dunham, Pearl Primus. These are artists. They can go to, like Paul Robeson, Marian Anderson. That is the generation of possibility. It was very interesting. I did a project with Judith Jamison, Joe Myers Brown, and Dolores Brown, who grew up in the 30s and the 40s, right? And I asked, like, because from my perspective, I'm like, oh God, it must have been so hard. Like, you didn't see any possibilities. And Dolores Brown said to me, no, we were excited. We saw everything. We saw possibilities. We were coming out of a war. In war, people come together for the common cause, and the concept of possibility, even for Black people, even with segregation, for them it felt like a time where anything was possible. And so it doesn't surprise me that these are the people that were coming of age out of the 40s, 50s, and really the 60s and the 70s, that's when things are really starting to, those people have matured, and some of them have had great success and are opening doors, right? So that's, I don't know, I'm rambling now.
No, not at all. And Linda says, awesome response. Thank you. And yes, I would say from my part, studying Gordon Parks' photographs, it totally aligns with what you say, what he's trying to do in this ballet film, because in his photographs, he's composing images that are directly in dialogue with, iconic works of art in Western art history that are made by white artists, and putting himself directly in reference to them, asking for a comparison, and seeing that parallel. I think that he's really asserting that he has a place, next to those excellent artists.
You know what's really funny? This brings up the whole civil rights movement, right? And the idea that it was strategic that the protesters wore suits and ties and their Sunday best. And it was because they wanted to humanize themselves in the eyes of white people. So they said, we have to look like them, and hopefully they'll see us as human, right? And so that's that in his work, he's saying, we're just like you.
Yeah.
We're just like you.
Yes.
And are we viewing this piece of art as something done for whiteness? Like for the lens of whiteness, right? Like or is it for his community? Is he telling a story because we, the people, his people, need to see it? Right? So even as historians, we have to look at the lens of implicit bias, right? We have to look at the way that we've been learning and been taught, and our perspective, because that is a part of how the system gets held together. It's the stories that we tell, right? It's the perspective that we tell those historical stories for. Because if you're looking through the lens of a Native American person, an indigenous person, that history is very different, right? From a colonizer coming over, right? Who's the villain? Who's the victor? Right? All of those things, that's what we have to start to interrogate, because we've had this very, very sort of narrow concept of the way that we are supposed, I mean, we're unearthing a whole bunch of narratives that were left, that were omitted or
Mhm.
destroyed or bastardized and altered. And so we're needing to kind of untwist those things and add in the bits that weren't there, so we have a more complete picture, right, of what that is. I guess that's what I'm asking for. I mean, that's part of what my work strives to do, right?
Yes,
Is to ask us to open up,
yes.
what we think.
Yes, and I'm just gonna add too that, your Memoirs of Blacks in Ballet.org website is such a great repository of history. And Sheila Rohan, who played Rosa Parks in the ballet film Martin, is in your roll call. So you have this roll call with all the names of the Black artists um, that you've been able to, document, and you can find their biographies there. And I believe on your website even you have an excerpt of Sheila Rohan dancing Martin. So, it's a great, great resource and an ongoing project that's just going to get better and better. So I urge everybody to check that out. And
Just
yeah,
dropped
you
it.
just put, yeah, you put the website name there. Everybody, please check that out.
It's interesting because my ballet started with the roll call, which was crowdsourced at first. I think we're at 607 names of professional ballet dancers, past and present. We have a historical timeline that's
Yes.
animated. It's very beautiful. My digital designer, Natasha Hume, is just like a rock star.
Yeah.
And what I did there was I took these data points and I wanted to contextualize them in history at large, right? So you'll go on and you'll see this point, and then it'll be like other happenings in that year. And it's world history, American history, arts and science. I like to throw like who won the Oscar, in there, because it helps people imagine or like remember what the world was,
Mhm.
in that, what it took to create that data point. And then we have the Constellation Project, which is really, it starts off as like mapping history, but it's really an anthropological sort of study, because not only do you get the artist and whose orbit they were in or who's in their orbit, but you also get to see a bit of how Black culture helped support the art and the artists. So you have, historically Black colleges and universities being a space where not only where artists are being educated, but they're being actually supported, right? Like you have the Greek letter organizations, the Black fraternities and sororities that were actually one of the levels, like the Links is a social organization of through the Black sororities and fraternities, and they would actually hire dancers, opera singers, musicians for their events, their cotillions and things like this, right? So there was a parallel society of art that was being held and created and financed by people of color, right? For people of color. FUBU, which is also, what is it, 1920, I believe it's 26, was W.E.D. Du Bois wrote the criteria for Negro art, right? And that's FUBU, for us, by us, near us,
Mhm.
right? So that's also coming, you see the progression of how we get to some of this work,
Yeah,
and Gordon is documenting it
yeah,
in ways so that we don't forget, so you don't forget, so there is a history.
yeah. And yeah, that's another part of your website, which is Constellation, where, it's like mapped out visually who's connected to whom, and it's a great resource. So I would say we actually went over time just because we had so much to say, you know, and I really benefited from your insights and really appreciate you coming on. Thank you, Theresa. And thank you to everyone who joined us. And I will say goodbye and good night. And this concludes our program. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for your questions.
Thank you for the opportunity. It was a pleasure.
Bye.
Bye-bye.